There's nothing that says that people with severe trauma disorders can't be very, like, have families, get married, and that sounds silly, right. And it's sad that we even have to make that distinction, to be honest.
Right. It's like life goes forward.
Life goes forward, and just because my brain is wired differently than the average person, it really just means that my brain is wired differently than the average person. Like, that's literally as far as it has to go.
Welcome back to the Sign of Good Health podcast. Today I'm with Tori, and we're going to be talking about dissociative identity disorder. So you want to start just introducing yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Tori, and I was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder in 2019. And yeah, it's something that I'm very passionate about spreading awareness on, because there's a lot of very heavy stigmas around this disorder specifically, and a lot of misunderstandings. So yeah, I'm excited about it.
Yeah, so let's start with just talking about like what dissociative identity disorder is, like how it forms.
Mm-hmm. So DID is something that is a trauma-based disorder, and it forms in early childhood. As you grow up through childhood, around the age of 7 to 9 is when your identity/personality kind of fuses all together, because you're kind of mimicking everything up until that point. So you really start to form your own identity around those ages, and if you have severe repeated trauma before those ages, it kind of puts a stop in the gears and pauses you before your identity has a chance to really fully develop and integrate into one.
So, and semi-recently, I don't know when specifically, but the name changed from multiple personality disorder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so multiple personality disorder is the term that actually most people are more familiar with. Typically, if I say I have dissociative identity disorder and they kind of look confused, I usually say it's multiple personality disorder that just changed the name. Like, oh, yeah. So they actually changed it in the 1990s because they started finding out more about dissociation as a concept and realizing that, this doesn't really have as much to do with like a personality thing as it does a full dissociation into different forms or different states of identity. So it was kind of a symbolizing of the community becoming more aware of what this was actually being caused by and how it works.
So let's talk a little bit about like what dissociation is.
Okay. So dissociation is a big word, and a lot of people don't know how common it is. So when you hear people say things like getting lost in a good book, or sometimes when you're driving down the road, I know people that have had the experience where they're driving down the road and you start thinking about things, and all of a sudden you realize you're still driving on the road and going straight somehow because your brain kind of went on autopilot as you're going. Everybody pretty much experiences some level of dissociation, because your brain is literally just taking a break from reality in some sense. A lot of times people that have been through traumas will talk about having an out-of-body experience, and that's another form of dissociation. So that's kind of the basis for all dissociative disorders, is that your brain is dissociating to an extent that it's more frequent or it's more severe than the average person.
Okay, and that's different than, is it like a more extreme version of like how people act differently at work versus church versus home and that kind of stuff?
Right, so when you go to work, you're still Alex, right? You're Alex at work, and you're Alex at home, and you're Alex at church, and your personality or your identity, kind of think of it as a marble where it's kind of seamlessly rolling from one identity state to another. You don't have breaks in between those shifts. They just happen seamlessly. For somebody with dissociative identity disorder, it's more like a die or a dice. It's like different identities on all the different sides, and we kind of chunk from side to side. It's much less graceful, basically. And whereas instead of being Tori at work and Tori at home kind of concept, there are completely separate states of identity called alters within my brain that will react to any given scenario to say, oh, I need to take over now because we're dealing with this thing and that's my thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So is it, let's talk a little bit about the Inside Out movie, because they're the,
Yes.
the different emotions kind of
Yes.
take over for different stuff.
Yeah. Inside Out is actually like one of the movies that I use to illustrate what it looks like in my head, because when I watched that movie I was like, oh my gosh, I relate to this on so many levels, because it's kind of like there's a joystick in the front, and you know, whoever has their hand on it at the time is kind of making the decisions and deciding like what we're doing and who we're talking to and all of that.
And how Riley acts.
And how, exactly. So, but instead of it being the emotions driving the same person, kind of it's like the body is like the vehicle, and you know, different states of an identity will come forward, or the alters will come forward to respond to other different situations that you get to in life. And yeah, a lot with the emotion side of things, it's kind of funny because a lot of people that I talk to, one of the number one comments I get is, oh, well, yeah, like sometimes I'm more happy and sometimes I'm more sad, and which is, yes, everybody experiences that, but with DID, it's not like, this is the happy Tori and this is the sad Tori. Like each alter has very distinct their own set of emotions, they have their own worldviews, their own, you know, thoughts, and they might be completely different from mine as the host, which sounds super sci-fi. The host is basically just the term for the person that is in the front the most, and the person that's largely living life. So, but yeah, it's really funny when people try to, and it's them just trying to understand and put it into something relatable, which can be really hard with something like DID. It's hard to relate to.
Right. So let's talk a little bit more. So alters, there's different types. You know,
yeah. There's a lot of different types of alters, and I don't have like an official full list, but the main ones, you have the chart.
That helps.
Thank you. The main ones, so you've got the most common types of alters that you'll hear people talk about a lot. You have protectors, which is pretty self-explanatory. These are often alters that are created to respond to emotional or physical threats, external threats. Sometimes internal, like, oh, things kind of like the red alarms in Inside Out. Things are getting really emotional here. We got to stabilize things. So that's basically their job, is just to respond to, like, if I was under a physical threat, you know, I have a protector that would step forward because I would feel like I couldn't handle that. So there's that. Then you have gatekeepers, which if you want to kind of view them as like the guy with the neon batons on an airstrip, where he's like, okay, you go this way, you go that way, here's the information you're allowed to access. Like, yeah. They're kind of the secretary, in a sense, of the system. And you can have multiple of any of these. There's caretakers, and they're basically like the moms of the system, where they just kind of take care of everybody. They're really nice. They're the people that oftentimes, or the alters that people will often enjoy. Like, they're very nice, very warm, and nurturing.
So is that taking care of the alters or people in the real world? Or
can be both.
Both?
Yep. So I have, you know, some caretakers that are more internal, and then others that would be more, oh, I need to take care of somebody on the external side of things. So they can definitely respond to multiple roles, whether internal or outside. And, you know, on the inside of things, it feels like there's a whole inner world there where they all look very different from me on the inside. Like, all anybody that meets me is ever going to see is me as I am, but they're not going to see what everybody else looks like on the inside, which sometimes is very drastically different. So yeah, the caretakers also, one of their main roles typically is to take care of specifically another group of alters called littles. And that basically, that's another word that has gotten hijacked a lot, and there's some really weird like stuff around that, but for DID specifically, littles are just minors. Like, when you are forming DID and you're going through trauma as a child, you're creating altars that are the same age as you are when the trauma happens. So a lot of the altars are stuck at those ages. So the caretakers will often, kind of be the babysitters of the system, so to speak. It is funny though, because one little thing that I'll share is that sometimes if I'm in a conversation, one of the things that could happen is one of the caretakers would say something like, "You could have said that a little bit nicer," like that kind of, which is really funny because they want everybody to be harmonious. So yeah, those are kind of the like main 5. Sure. I think that was 5. Did I do 4 or 5 that's types? Yeah. The one type that I will mention that I think is where a lot of people, you'll see a lot of the negative media representation start, is with altars that are called persecutors. And persecutors it's a tough word to use to describe them because their roles are very complex and they're not, when people think of people with DID like, oh, those are the scary altars or whatever. No, those are the altars that hold some of the hardest stuff for the system. They oftentimes are very upset and afraid of things because of what they hold. And just like with anybody else, one of the goals is just to help them be more harmonious with the system and to kind of learn how to channel what their role is in a positive way. So yeah, I mean, that's literally all it is. A lot of people will push that to an extreme and make it something that it's not. And one of the things that I think is really important to note is people with DID are statistically highly unlikely to do any harm to anybody. It's statistically way more likely that we would be re-traumatized than anything else just because, there's a level of vulnerability there, I think. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you talked about a little bit with the protectors are like holding memories, so does that mean like, so the
gatekeepers do?
The persecutors?
The persecutors, yeah.
Yeah, so they, the person creates the persecutor to like hold on to the traumatic memory.
The really hard stuff. Yeah, and that it can be, everybody's system is very different, and like we talked about before, it's such a spectrum. No two systems are exactly alike. It manifests very differently because everybody's experience, trauma, personality, everything is different. So oftentimes the persecutors hold some of the hardest stuff in the system, but it can be split up in very, there can be a lot of pieces that get spread out over the system because especially with bigger traumas, you need more boxes to hold all of these things because it's just too much altogether. So your brain literally to survive the trauma will take pieces and be like, okay, you get this and you get this and you get this, have fun with that. And then as you kind of start becoming aware of everybody in the system, now you can start putting pieces together and say like, oh, so you hold this and you hold this and they're from the same thing. Oh, that makes so much more sense now. Yeah.
So you're going to talk a little bit more about like how do you discover or recognize or like learn about the altars? Yeah,
so it really depends. Sometimes I will discover them through therapy where we'll start touching on a memory or something like that and then I'll be like, oh, somebody's attached to this. Hi. Sorry, I wasn't supposed to notice you. But oftentimes the more common is typically you'll hear people talk about discovering a protector first because they're in a situation where the protector needed to do their job and the host will be like, oh, hey, who are you and what are you doing here? So that's typically where you'll see a lot of people start is getting contacted or not contacted, that makes it sound like E.T. But, you become aware of that kind of separate presence or identity that feels very, very separate from you, even though it's still you. It's very hard to explain. A lot of times the altars will come forward and once you start becoming aware and just say, hey, this is my name, and you know, all of the ones that I have told me their name. Yeah, and it's always interesting because sometimes I'm like, okay, cool. Yeah, so that's usually how, at least from my experience and from what I've seen in the community, like that's usually a kind of just slow awareness. Or if a trauma happens in adulthood that triggers somebody, it's harder to keep that facade of nothing's here, nothing's wrong, and that's where usually the host will say, oh, yeah, I definitely noticed somebody else was, you know, taking part in our response to that. So,
Sure.
yeah.
So, when we talked earlier, we talked about like to like learn about them. You talked about the visualization process.
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember exactly where I went with that.
Yeah, I don't know if you gave me a lot of details. You just kind of mentioned it, and I was just curious.
Yeah, so visualization, in a sense, has really helped me with therapy specifically, but also for me at least, and I know for a lot of other people with DID, the inner world is very vibrant and very easy to visualize for us, where it feels like Inside Out, where, you know, you've got the main screen that's looking out at the world, and then you've got this whole inner world that is going on behind the scenes, which for any normal person, it feels like, you know, you've got your thoughts all the time, and you're thinking through things, and there's always, like, people are always thinking, and there's things going on in the back of their head, but for me it feels like a literal separate world sometimes. Mm-hmm. And in internal, I visualize the different alters as they see themselves, and it's very interesting to see how different they all look, and how each of them, like, they look like their own person on the inside. Mm-hmm. And for some of them, it's hard because they know, like, nobody's ever going to see them as their own person, which is kind of hard, and it's something that, you know, sometimes we have to work through. But
right.
Yeah.
So, and then do they have their own, like, history or like memories and stuff?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So
like they're like fully formed people, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's literally like if you put 5 different people in a room, and they all have their own, you know, experiences, whether it's coming from something they actually experienced in the reality versus something that they have as kind of a their own created history that came
Sure.
along with them when they came from when they split off from whatever trauma it was. Yeah, they definitely have their own worldviews, thoughts, experiences. They're going to respond to things very differently, and you'll see this with a lot of systems where it's, for people that really struggle with whether this is a real thing or not, it's amazing. There are CAT scans that have been done of people with DID when they switch between alters, and you can see the shift on the brain scan. It's amazing to watch. Different parts of the brain will light up when that happens. Or like there are certain systems I know of where one alter is allergic to a certain kind of food. Like it's pretty
Yeah.
like detailed. Like it's amazing how much the brain can change between those two states of identity. Like I'm a big sweet tooth. I love donuts, right? And I had a protector earlier who hates anything sugary, did not have a sweet, and like the taste was totally different for her, where she was like, ugh, donuts, and I'd come back and I'd be like, are you kidding? Why would you not eat this? You know? So like little things like that, it's amazing how different sometimes the different alters can be.
Yeah, 'cause some of the stuff I was reading about, like some of the alters in some cases of like more severe abuse can cause like blindness or
Yes.
or just like
Physical
disability.
ailments.
Yeah,
Yep. Yep.
So and then you also have like different ages, like if you're an older, like elderly person or something,
Mm-hmm.
they just move differently.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. It definitely, that's one of the things that people who know me really well can tell body language change very quickly if they're watching for it, because they, you know, are obviously around it more, so they can easily tell the difference between like, oh, this is, I'm talking to somebody, you know, somebody else in the system now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and then we touched on this earlier, but just for the sake of the podcast, it's just
Yeah.
People that know you well and know the different ones, do they still talk to you as Tori, or do they
Mhm.
use the different names?
It depends. I've always left it really open to other people's comfort level to some degree, where I don't expect people to like know them all. And honestly, I don't share,
Right.
all of them with everybody. So it's definitely kind of in levels of how much I trust people with that information. But it depends. Some of my closer friends that really, it's kind of like when you get to know somebody, you're going to be a little bit more formal as you're meeting them for the first time, and then as you start developing a relationship with them and even some friendship, and you have some life experience together, now you're going to be a lot more informal, relaxed. And so for the people closest to me that interact with the different alters and know it, they will say, oh hey, so and so, like, because they'll recognize that that's who they're talking to. And that can be very validating sometimes, and make everybody feel a little bit more.
Yeah, it helped them
ease.
feel like, because you talked about how they may not feel like they're going to be seen ever, and that's
Right.
that little bit of recognition.
Right, and that's literally when it comes back down to like a mental health side of things, it's literally parts of you that are seeking approval and validation.
Right.
And so, in a sense, that's a really important thing to do in a safe environment with them, so that they feel like, yeah, I'm a part of the system, and people appreciate and approve of me, and I'm important too, kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like one aspect of like the whole dissociative identity disorder is the point of it is it's a invisible disability because you're doing this to handle the trauma and blend in and be like nothing's wrong.
Nothing's wrong, everything's fine here. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things, I know when we did our pre-podcast talk, invisible illnesses are something that, is kind of a tangent topic to DID, but I think it's very relevant because, DID exists to prove to the world that everything is completely fine. Don't draw any attention to anything going on here, and it's also a brain that has gone through a lot of really horrible things and is now trying to jury-rig a system together to kind of like stumble down the road sort of thing.
And you're figuring this out when you're 7 to 9.
Exactly. Like... And when you're a child and you're developing DID, you don't realize what it is because you don't have the awareness, of course, at that point to know, oh, well, normal people don't have like protectors that show up when X happens, or but one of the things you'll notice with diagnoses is that most of the time people are a little bit older when they get diagnosed, in their like 20s plus, because you get to a point where this system that your brain jury-rigged as a child, and it's very, very sophisticated and amazing that our brains can do this to survive trauma, but you get to a point in your adult life where you can't keep up that facade forever, and something is off here, something's different, and that's usually when you start noticing things that are different and weird and stuff, and that's usually when not everybody goes in for it. There's a lot of people, I'm sure, with DID that like kind of suspect they have something like it, but they're afraid to go in because there's a lot of stigma, and it's scary to have a big disorder like that, because what's going to happen? How do I, like, now that I know that I have this because of trauma, that means now that the trauma exists.
Right.
And this is what we as a system have been trying to avoid this whole time.
Right.
So yeah, it's a lot to work through.
Yeah. So are there common patterns that, like, in the diagnostic process or would cause people to seek a diagnosis? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because I know, like we said, like everybody, it's a spectrum. It's all going to be different.
Yeah.
But are there patterns or semi-common things?
For me, at least, just as a basic thing, I was 28 when I was diagnosed, but I kind of I was aware of things and other, there were more of me in here than I thought, from quite a ways before that, in kind of teenage years even. And it was literally just on survival mode of, you know, I don't want people to think I'm crazy.
Yeah.
Like, you know, because people kind of go the direction of like, oh, you're hearing voices kind of thing. And that's a completely different disorder that actually gets mixed up with DID quite often. But it got to the point where I just was like, I don't know what's going on in my brain, and there's multiple people in here. How do we, and I swear I'm not crazy, kind of. I mean, that's the kind of, you know, that fear of how do you talk to people about this? Because it's hard for people to wrap their brain around, but you don't look crazy. You know, and that's a word that people like to throw around when they talk about mental health stuff. And I'm like, no, that's the whole goal. I'm glad it's working. Yay! We're doing great, system. Nobody knows.
Yeah, that's hard too, because it's like just the, you know, what is normal, and it's like what you've grown up with in your reality is just...
Yeah, like the idea that quote-unquote normal people don't have conversations with different versions of themselves in their head all the time is... like, wow, it must be quiet. Like, that's what I think of all the time when I talk to people that are just singular fused personalities. I'm just like, wow, how, like, that sounds so quiet. And how do you, like, I guess it's just what you know and what you've grown up with and are used to for, you know, because if you think about it, I'm almost 30. That's almost 25 years, plus years of my life that I don't know anything different. So to me, it's not weird. You guys are all weird. Right?
Yeah. So I forgot to ask about this earlier. Like, you're going to touch on a little bit just with alters being able to like integrate or go dormant. Yeah.
So integration is another really big word that is easily explained by you have two different alters. Say you have a caretaker and a protector or something, and the system as a whole is getting to a point where these two alters know, or the system says we could function better if these two were together, if they were one alter instead of two. So from a really, really basic sense, if you think of the color purple, it's still blue and red, but it's also its own color. Like, it still holds the same original primary colors, but now it has its own flavor and its own, so that's what integration looks like, is when two alters kind of fuse together and become one new alter. And that can happen at any time with any alters. It's almost impossible to predict anything like that. Going dormant is just alters that like don't, either they're burned out because they've been like, you know, working so hard for the system for such a long time that they just need a break, or alters that are not unnecessary, but they're not needed as much as they were when they were created, so they just kind of go quiet. Alters can't die. That's something that like when I die, obviously, like that's the end of everybody, but that people sometimes get hung up on, oh, well, they can't die inside the system. That doesn't work.
Right.
They can integrate and they can go dormant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about the cure and treatment stuff a little later, but like when two alters integrate, is there any kind of like, is there a awareness or like, my mind just goes to like video games, like a giant beam shoots
of
up.
light, and now we have this new alter. Ta-da! Yes. I mean, it really depends on the alter, to be honest. But typically, there is some awareness, especially if they were a major part of the system. Like, you know, if you have a main protector that integrates, it's going to be pretty quick that everybody's like, oh, wait a second, you look different. But oftentimes, I mean, it depends. Sometimes integrations can happen in the back that you don't know about until you're like, oh, wait a second, did that, oh, okay, cool, love that.
Yeah.
But yeah, typically if it's more toward the main group of alters that kind of run everything, then it's going to be pretty, like, if you're already aware that you are a system and you know who everybody is, it's pretty hard not to notice. Yeah.
So one thing that I was reading about with like the therapy process that I just thought was a really interesting line was just the concept of all of the alters need to be accepted. Like, and you talked about like not trying to, the alters can't die, so like you need to learn to work together.
They're there.
Basically.
Yeah. Yeah, so typically, and I should have made this disclaimer at the very beginning of the podcast, but I'm not a medical professional, so obviously like this is all just from my personal experience and also research I've done. But yeah, typically with any DID system, and this holds true with most accepted forms of therapy and also with people that deal with it, the first goal, I guess, if you want to call it a goal, is to stabilize and communicate. That's kind of like the two main things. First, we get everybody stable. We start communicating, okay, who is all in here? What are you, not even what are you holding, because it's kind of like, so what's your trauma?
Right.
Let's talk about it. Hey,
yeah.
nice to meet you. What's your trauma?
It's
yeah.
more like just what are you here for? What are you worried about?
Yeah.
Like,
well, let's have a conference room. Like, one of the visualization things that helps a lot of people with DID is imagining some kind of a room where we can all sit together and talk about, okay, what are you like? What are your concerns, and what do you feel like you do in the system? Like, what do you do, and what are you, all that kind of stuff. Just so you kind of start building awareness of your team. I mean, it's literally just like a group project. You're all getting together, and okay, so what are you good at? And okay, cool, and like here's how we can work together on that. So yeah, I've learned a ton of like real life applicable, like working with other people lessons from having a system, because there's a lot of very different. It's literally like a dysfunctional family in your head. So learning how to work with everybody's differences and kind of achieving that kind of harmony is a major first step.
But with the treatment, it's like it's based on like the trauma is the problem. The multiple alters and stuff are not the problem.
Yeah, so it really typically will focus on trauma, because people often assume that like one of the main things that I get as a comment or question, I guess, when I talk about DID and what it is and get to talking about the alters, is people will ask me stuff like, well, how do you get rid of them? Which is such a strange comment. And I can see where, somebody that doesn't have DID, I get that, because they're still kind of thinking about it in a different light than what it actually is. But the alters aren't the problem. The alters are they're
part of you.
They're part of me. So if like I would literally have to be ripping out parts of my identity as a whole, just because they have very strong separate, boundaries in between them, unlike a normal person. They're all still parts of the same whole working together. So it's not the alters, it's identifying and working through the traumas and the things that came from that are now affecting my life, that the alters are all trying to fix and help. So it's people kind of put the wrong focus on the alters as being the negative aspect of this,
right?
As opposed to this is the problem, the alters are helping me deal with it.
Yeah, and like we were talking about, like with the autism stuff, like my own philosophy is like you're not going to cure autism, but you can, because it's just how your brain is wired.
Right.
But you can learn to deal with some of the more negative symptoms of it, like the sensory sensitivity and the whatever digestive issues or whatever else you have.
Exactly.
So,
yeah, exactly. And that's the thing with DID too, is learning coping mechanisms and learning, like, there's nothing that says that people with severe trauma disorders can't be very, like, have families, get married, and that sounds silly,
Right.
And it's sad that we even have to make that distinction, to be honest.
Right. It's like life goes forward.
Life goes forward, and just because my brain is wired differently than the average person, it really just means that my brain is wired differently than the average person. Like, that's literally as far as it has to go. And I may have to adjust certain parts of my life that I can't, like, it's going to look different for me than some other people just because of how my brain works, but also what I've been through. But that's not as, you're responsible for, we talked about this too, you're responsible for your own healing, and I don't view it as something that gives me a free pass for anything, which I think is a big thing with mental health is, making adjustments to help people with mental health, I think is really important.
Yeah.
But it doesn't, don't use it as kind of coming from that victim mentality of, well, I should just get a free pass through everything because I have, X disorder or whatever. Really work hard to make your life as fulfilling and as awesome as you possibly can, because there's nothing, just because you have certain things to work with, it doesn't mean that you can't achieve whatever.
Yeah, and I know we both have the same kind of very high value on personal growth, and we hate the kind of babying mentality.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, and when you can just see, there are people that really get confused by when I start talking about DID, and then there are people that kind of have the reaction, oh, I'm so sorry.
You're
which
so helpless.
and I appreciate,
You're broken.
yes, thank you for acknowledging my trauma, but at the same time, I might react differently to certain things than the average person, but that doesn't, it doesn't make me that different. I mean, when you think about how diverse people are in general, it's really not that big of a stretch. So. Yeah,
and I do have, just as I've learned more about life, I just assume that everybody's got some kind of issue.
Something, yep. We all have bags that we carry for, yep, exactly.
So it's it's like trauma, and then just, learning, you kind of touched on it already, just kind of learning to work as a team. Yeah,
yep, that's step one for a DID system, that's learning how to function.
So do you want to talk a little bit about just how, and this could be more general or your own experience, just how does negotiation or communication with the alters work?
The same as negotiation or communication between people do, to be honest. Sometimes it goes really, really well and we're like, yes, go team. Sometimes it's a drawn out pain in the butt and we're all trying to, because everybody might have different opinions about it and be bringing up different concerns. And it's very similar to just having a conversation between a group of people. You're all coming from different angles, and sometimes it's stressful trying to get everybody on the same page. Yeah.
So are those conversations in your head, or is it helpful to write stuff down? Or?
I know a lot of, so again, being on the spectrum of DID, some systems have diaries where they will leave each other notes, for example, because on the severe end of the spectrum, you can have people who have amnesia barriers that are so powerful that they will not remember what happened to them for the last 2 to weeks, sometimes longer. Sometimes they can go very long periods of time not remembering what happened. So, it really depends on knowing your system and knowing how much you need to communicate, and how, I'm fortunate to not have that severe of the amnesia barriers between alters. And this is kind of a nerdy thing, but one of the other things that doesn't get talked about enough with DID is emotional amnesia, as opposed to a physical amnesia, because emotional amnesia is very, very big part of DID too, where I can sit here and describe to you in absolute detail all of the trauma things that I remember and feel absolutely nothing, because all of the fear and the hurt and all of those things are stored somewhere else, and somebody else, quote unquote, holds that.
Right.
So I don't remember where I was going with that, but just kind of the making sure that emotional amnesia is something that I think we just don't talk about enough either.
Right. Yeah, and I know I brought this up in the pre-podcast talk where it's just, I know I've had times where I feel upset, but I don't know why, and it's like, I don't know where these feelings are coming from.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, that's very, a lot of people can probably relate to that, where it's like, okay, where is this coming from? And I feel that as a DID system, where I know it's coming from someone back here, like, okay,
Right.
who got triggered? What happened? Because I don't know oftentimes, and sometimes an alter will have a very strong reaction to something, and I'm stuck trying to figure out, like, why are we reacting to this? What happened? Did I miss something? I missed something. Okay, team huddle. We gotta figure this out. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was reading I don't know if you follow Mark Manson at all, but he put out an article last week about like meditation and the downsides of it with people having the negative reactions. And he also writes about, like, he put out another one about, like, Stoicism and Buddhism, and just, like, the stuff, like, trying to suppress emotions really messes people up. So it's also, like, I don't know what to think, because it's like, it's valuable to toughen up a little bit too. Right. So it's like, what do you do with that?
Yeah.
And I'm just working on getting my head around that.
Yeah, I think it's really important, because I think suppressing is the key word there. I think suppressing emotions, you know, if you're like, okay, I'm in a situation where there's something really serious happening and I need to suppress that fear for the moment so that I can react with a clear head, that's obviously a very healthy, normal part of, sometimes we need to do that too. But I think where it becomes a problem is when it is a prolonged, I'm going to suppress this as long as I possibly can and ignore that I ever felt that. You know, if you think about being in a really stressful situation and you suppress that fear and you do what you need to do, and then afterwards you have this physical reaction to it sometimes where your body just kind of has to catch up.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, that's kind of, for me and for a lot of other people with DID, I think is kind of in a really long-term sense what's happening, where that suppression happened for a really long period of time, and now our bodies are kind of starting to catch up with all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's just got me thinking about, like, I don't know, just like with macho man culture, and it's like, you know, don't cry, be a man, be tough, and then it's just like that, because even read about, like, the ancient Greek, like Alexander the Great weeps after he wins a battle and whatever, and it's like men have emotions.
Yeah, right? Yeah, I don't know where we ever got to a point where we felt like that was something men didn't need to have.
Yeah.
Because it's actually really unhealthy for anybody to be like, oh, I don't cry. Sometimes, you know what? Sometimes you just need to have a good cry, and it's really good for you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know where we ever got on that mindset.
Yeah.
But it's silly and it needs to go away.
Yeah, and that's a whole topic for another day. So.
Part 2.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've been going for close to an hour. So,
yeah, I'm trying really hard to stay, like, not tangented, because there's so much with this.
Yeah, but I think we can call it. So,
cool.
I don't know if there's anything you want to recommend for people.
I think one of the things that I would encourage people, if you meet somebody with DID and they share with you that they have it, the most powerful thing you can do, literally, is instead of making assumptions about it or trying to fix right away, which a lot of people, well-meaning, try to do.
Right.
I get a lot, bless their hearts, I get a lot of people who are very, very kind and supportive. I've been very blessed to have a lot of support throughout this experience, and but a lot of people will come up and be like, oh, well, I worry a lot too sometimes. You know, when you're talking about anxiety or something like that, I'm like trying to explain to people that it's not the same thing. It's
right.
But without, like, dumping a lot of really dark stuff on them sometimes, to say, well, you know, sometimes people's brain go a little farther than that. But yeah, just the best thing that you can do to support people is just to ask questions about what their life is like and what they're willing to share with you. Like, don't ever ask anybody what their trauma is. That's like number one rule of mental health. Like, just don't. Just don't ask. If and when they're willing to share anything with you, great. But like, that's like the number one, do not ask that question. Do not ask that ever. So yeah, I think, just asking, like, I've really appreciated how open of a conversation we've been able to have about this, and that people that ask me, oh, well, what is that like, and how does that look different during day? I love questions like that because it shows me that they're just curious about what my brain is like.
Yeah, and that was the whole point of this conversation,
Right.
was just bringing that awareness of like, you know, I've heard of multiple personality disorder, but I've only seen split or whatever, and it's like, okay.
Don't ask anybody in the DID community what they think of that movie, because you will get very strong reactions. Yes.
Yeah, so.
Don't listen to the media representation either.
Right.
Ever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so thanks for being on the show. And
Yeah, thanks for having me.
yeah.